Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there's more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 1 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, and the true story of their remarkable escape from Alcatraz. Now let's get started with our story about the escape from Alcatraz. On August 5th, 1775, the Spanish mariner Juan Manuel de Ayala sailed through what is known today as the city of San Francisco's Golden Gate and entered San Francisco Bay. Ayala was part of a coordinated Spanish land and sea expedition exploring the current state of California. As the first European to traverse this waterway, he charted several islands in the central harbor, including one he named Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans. With the advent of English speakers in the 19th century, this name was anglicized to Alcatraz Island. Well into the 1800s, this property remained privately owned, inhabited mostly by thousands of the brown pelicans who were the origin of the location's name. Eventually, on November 6, 1850, certain areas of San Francisco Bay were seized by an executive order proclaimed by President Millard Fillmore and designated as federal property, California having recently been admitted as America's 31st state. With little residential potential, Alcatraz became part of a series of planned fortifications meant to protect the Bay Area from any hostile incursion. While these fortifications were not fully implemented, Alcatraz was heavily armed, with batteries containing over 100 massive artillery cannons. The city of San Francisco, already an important and thriving West Coast outpost. The island would also assume several other important roles during this time period. The first lighthouse ever constructed on the West Coast completed on Alcatraz in 1854. With U.S. military outposts installed throughout the western region, the need for a military prison arose, the island housing prisoners from its earliest days. In the early 20th century, the barracks area was demolished and replaced by a more formal, massive concrete cell block completed in 1912. Many conscientious objectors, opposed to U.S. participation in World War I, including their own conscription, were jailed at Alcatraz in harsh conditions. These prisoner sentences were extended by a refusal to obey any military order, including refusal to wear a uniform or participate in a work detail. In 1933, the federal government eventually transferred control of the Alcatraz facility from the military to the U.S. Department of Justice and its Federal Bureau of Prisons. This was one aspect of the government's attempt to diffuse public concern over a perceived national crime wave conducted by several notorious criminals and gangsters fomenting murder, violence, and corruption across the United States. It was the intent of law enforcement to create a maximum security repository for those criminals considered to be among the most high-profile or dangerous and institutionally incorrigible. Among the first of these worst of the worst federal prisoners deliberately included prominent individuals like George Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone, Doc Barker, and Alvin Karpis. However, after this initial public relations aspect of Alcatraz faded with the diminishing amount of Depression-era criminal violence, Individuals without a public profile were still frequently sent to the island, specifically to punish them for continued incorrigible behavior, usually revolving around attempts at escape. In addition to its strict discipline, isolation, and unpleasant weather conditions, Alcatraz's notorious reputation also included another aspect that its prisoners found most unappealing. It was generally considered to be escape-proof, with any such attempts resulting not only in failure, but possibly even in death in the turbulent and freezing cold water of San Francisco Bay. Although only 1.25 miles from the city of San Francisco itself, any individual attempting to swim this distance would have to contend with a formidable tidal current that made such an attempt extremely dangerous, probably resulting in drowning, the unfortunate's body swept out of the bay into the Pacific Ocean. And even accessing such an escape on Alcatraz required first getting past several gun towers manned by sharpshooters, tall fences topped with razor wire, and guards patrolling the perimeter of the island. Of course, in such an environment, prisoners obsessed over the possibility of escape, and inevitable attempts occurred. The first was the April 27, 1936, spontaneous action of Joseph Bowers, a habitual thief, assigned to the prison incinerator. Considered unstable even by fellow prisoners, his behavior seemed to be an effort to make good on several previous attempts at suicide. Bowers ran to a chain-link fence over 50 feet tall that served as a barrier to the prison's shoreline. Attempting to scale this impediment, he was spotted by staff in a guard tower and warned both verbally and with gunshots to come down. He refused, was finally shot by a correctional officer manning the nearest tower, and fell a considerable distance to the ground. He subsequently died from his injuries. 18 months later, two men named Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe attempted a much more intricate escape. As work in one of the various prison industries was a major part of any Alcatraz inmate's incarceration, Rowe was assigned to the mat shop, which manufactured rubber desk mats from used tires, and Cole to the blacksmith shop. Housed in what was known as the industry's building, both of these men had spent weeks using stolen hacksaws to saw through the bars of a storage room window adjacent to their work areas. They concealed their handiwork with grease, paint chips, and metal shavings. On December 16, 1937, the area around Alcatraz was surrounded with extreme fog, making observation of the prison's exterior areas difficult. Cole and Rowe decided to take advantage of this situation to attempt an escape. Sometime after 1 p.m., the two men slipped into the storage room, popped the already sawed bars out of the windows, jumped out of the building to the ground below, and made their way to a locked gate and the exterior fence. With a wrench, they pried off the lock and hurried to the water's edge. They had also brought 5-gallon containers, welded shut with attached handles that they hoped would provide buoyancy. Several prisoners, aware of what Cole and Rowe were up to, watched discreetly from the windows as the men successfully waded into the water, jumped in, and were immediately swept away by the outgoing current, dragging them towards the Golden Gate. Within seconds, they disappeared into the fog, never to be seen again. Cole and Rowe's absence was revealed by a 130 head count that showed the two men missing. For the first time, Alcatraz was put into full lockdown escape mode and searched thoroughly, the escape route through the formerly locked gate quickly discovered. The Coast Guard was notified, but no trace of the men was ever found, either on the island or in the water. Needless to say, the escape made national news, and within weeks there were reports of the two men sighted in various taverns or pulling off robberies in their native Oklahoma. Unfortunately, although the fog helped conceal their exit from the prison, it was indicative of seasonal conditions that would have made their escape, even with a flotation device, extremely difficult. An especially high tide, the result of recent excessive rain, winter water temperatures of 52 degrees, and an outbound current moving at approximately 6 knots, or 8 miles per hour, would have made swimming against such momentum impossible. Several prisoners claimed to have seen the men struggling in the water, visible for a matter of minutes before disappearing altogether. After an extensive investigation by various law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, the official verdict was that Cole and Rowe drowned quickly and their bodies, never recovered, were swept out to sea. Although most likely dead, the two men were successful in puncturing the myth that escape from Alcatraz prison itself was impossible. This lesson was not lost on the prisoners that Cole and Rowe left behind. In the next 8 years, there would be 7 documented attempts to escape from Alcatraz. Although some of the prisoners actually managed to make it into the water, none achieved the relative success of Cole and Rowe. Each potential escapee either killed or recaptured and returned to the prison. Perhaps the most famous potential escapee was Arthur "Doc" Barker, a convicted murderer and bank robber associated with the notorious Barker Karpis gang. Alvin Public Enemy No. 1 Karpis, also a fellow inhabitant of Alcatraz. On January 13, 1939, Barker and 3 other men successfully exited the Alcatraz work area through previously hacksawed window bars, climbed over a high wall, and successfully made it to the edge of the water, where they split up and unsuccessfully attempted to swim in the direction of San Francisco, the strong tide pushing them back towards the shore. Barker then tried to assemble a makeshift raft out of debris and strips of his clothing, but was eventually spotted by correctional officers in a guard tower and a patrol boat, both opening fire. Doc Barker was hit in the head and died soon afterwards. The 3 other men were also quickly recaptured and returned to the prison. These failed escape attempts only instigated additional elaborate scheming on the part of other more determined inmates. Certainly Bernard "Barney" Coy fit the description of an obsessive focused on every aspect of the routines of all the guards in his vicinity and how he could identify and exploit even the most minute flaw in prison security. On May 2, 1946, Coy implemented some of his observations in an intricately planned operation involving overpowering guards, gaining access to the gun galleries that overlooked prisoner cells, and most importantly, seizing weapons that could be used to eventually take hostages, and the prison launch, facilitating a voyage to escape into central San Francisco. Despite his initial 1938 transfer status as incorrigible as a result of his behavior at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, by 1946, Coy was able to achieve the position of prison orderly. This allowed a great deal more mobility within the main cell block of the prison. In the early afternoon, Coy was sweeping the area within his cell block when another prisoner returning from the mess hall requested that a guard let him into the area. This prisoner, Marvin Hubbard, and Coy then overpowered the guard, William Miller, took his keys, locked him into a cell, and then began unlocking other cell doors. Knowing the routine of the gun gallery guard, Coy then climbed to the west gun gallery and used an improvised tool called a bar spreader to separate the bars of the gallery, allowing access to all floors of this sector. Hiding in the first floor gallery, he surprised another guard and took both his revolver and rifle, handing the pistol to a Confederate, Joseph Kretzer. Together, both armed men were able to threaten their way into the cell block's main control center. This allowed the release of many more prisoners on the second and third tiers, the convicts unable to open the electronically protected first tier. The plan then called for the escapees to access the recreation yard, shoot the corrections officers in the watchtowers, and then proceed to the prison dock and the launch. But, unfortunately for the prisoners, Corrections Officer Miller managed to secret the yard door key on his person when his other keys were taken, and then hide it, preventing egress from the cell block. An additional security feature of Alcatraz were locks that became unusable if tampered with or accessed by an incorrect key. The prisoners had control of the prison interior, but were now trapped inside, the exit door lock rendered impassable. Some of the prisoners, realizing that escape was now hopeless, returned to their cells, but 6 of the convicts resolved to fight it out. Thus ensued what became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. It took 2 days, 2 platoons of Marines, requested by the warden to assist with the operation, and a full-scale bombardment of the cell block with grenades and rifle fire to regain control of the situation. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard were subsequently found dead, possibly suicides. 2 other prisoners, Marion Thompson and Sam Shockley, surrendered and were eventually executed at San Quentin for their role in the uprising, which resulted in the deaths of 2 correctional officers and numerous injuries to other prison personnel. A 3rd prisoner, Clarence Carnes, Alcatraz's youngest inhabitant, was given an additional life sentence based on his age and testimony that he purposely avoided harming officers in their locked cells despite Kretzer's demand to shoot them dead. Perhaps intimidated by the ferocity of law enforcement's response to the May 2, 1946 attempt, it would be 10 years before another prisoner tried to escape. On July 23, 1956, convict Floyd Wilson walked away from his job location on the Alcatraz dock, intent on constructing a raft of some kind. It only took 12 hours to recapture him, hiding among some large rocks along the island's shoreline. On September 29, 1958, 2 other convicts made it to the water, the escapees aided by improvised flotation devices. One was immediately recaptured by a police patrol boat. 2 weeks later, the other's body was fished out of San Francisco Bay. By the late 50s, the prison administration could probably be excused for presuming that Alcatraz's reputation as a harsh and escape-proof facility was still well-deserved. But a confluence of factors would ultimately result in an incident that not only threatened to permanently remove this veneer of invulnerability, but also underlined whether or not the continuation of even operating such a prison made any kind of economic or logistical sense. First, the structure itself was starting to reflect the long-term effects of a harsh, frequently wet and windy climate that was many degrees colder than the relatively mild environment of the surrounding urban area. Even on a day when the temperature exceeded 70 degrees in downtown San Francisco, prisoners on the recreation yard at Alcatraz would require overcoats to deal with temperatures in the high 40s, accompanied by high winds, fog, and mist. Concrete, metal ventilation shafts, and wood were weakening, the physical plant showing signs of decades' worth of exposure. The sheer cost of running such a relatively remote operation also began to affect the logistics and security of Alcatraz. All food, materials, and other necessities had to be hauled to the island and stored. Hiring and keeping qualified correctional officers became increasingly difficult, as other opportunities made employment on Alcatraz, with its isolation for both guards and their families who lived on the island, a less than desirable occupation. Budget cuts meant that some of the guard towers were either temporarily or permanently unmanned, staff cutbacks also taking place within the cell block itself. Alcatraz could hold no more than 300 prisoners, so it could never serve as a major repository of federal inmates and usually held no more than 250 prisoners. By the 60s, the famous gangsters and notorious criminals of yesteryear had socially disappeared. What remained were those incorrigibles always present in any correctional system who, either because of length of sentence or personal outlook, focused obsessively on escape or defiance. Frequently, these same individuals also suffered from behavioral issues that made them additionally dysfunctional and unable to avoid problems at other federal penitentiaries, including such formidable institutions as Leavenworth or Atlanta. Although they did not realize it, unwittingly, officials within the federal prison system had situated some of the most resourceful and determined prison escape artists in one place in the entire history of the prison. Allen West first arrived on Alcatraz in April of 1954. Born in New York City, he spent his childhood in the Savannah, Georgia area. Although both of his brothers experienced normal childhoods, West was rebellious from an early age, classified as a delinquent and a high school dropout by age 14. Auto theft at age 15 got him sentenced to the Georgia State Training School for Boys. A frequent escapee, he was subsequently sent to the Georgia State Penitentiary for another 3-year auto theft conviction, escaping once again. A year later, he drew 6 to 15 years for both burglary and auto theft. Upon his release in September 1948, he decided to enlist in the Army and was stationed in Germany. It only took a year before he was formally court-martialed for numerous AWOL offenses. He then escaped from confinement in Germany. He was returned to the United States and sent to the Federal Reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio. By March of 1952, he was sentenced to 2 to 4 years in the Florida State Prison at Rayford, Florida. Escaping from this facility, he was next arrested January 27, 1953, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in possession of a machine gun and sawed-off shotgun. Upon conviction and considering his status as an extreme flight risk, West was sent to serve his federal sentence on Alcatraz. He seemed to settle down enough to be eventually sent back to the federal prison in Atlanta, where he was released to state custody in Florida. He immediately escaped and embarked on a lengthy spree involving robbery and interstate car theft, again a federal charge that got him assigned to Alcatraz in 1958. He was considered such a disciplinary problem that he was placed in Alcatraz's segregation unit, isolating him from the prison's general population and the unit's additional security, making any escape attempt completely unthinkable. Frank Lee Morris's childhood was much bleaker than Allen West's. Born on September 1, 1926, his mother was 17 years old. The identity of his father remains unclear. In any case, Morris was an orphan by the age of 11 and wound up in various foster home and juvenile facilities, which he fled from at the earliest opportunity. Despite an IQ of 133, Morris spent his teenage years involved in numerous instances of petty crime before an arrest for the November 24, 1955 robbery of the Bank of Slidell, Louisiana. Having previously escaped from Florida and Louisiana state prisons at Rayford and Angola, respectively, as well as the Orleans Parish Prison, Morris was sent to the relatively more secure federal prison at Atlanta. Initially, despite numerous activities and associations indicating a desire to escape and his record of having successfully fled every institution that he was assigned to, authorities were reluctant to transfer Morris to Alcatraz. Both his extremely high level of intelligence and frequently pleasant disposition compelled the staff to attempt to implement some attempt to induce a behavioral change. Ultimately, these attempts failed, and on January 20th, 1960, Frank Lee Morris arrived on the Rock. Even the family background of John and Clarence Anglin was unusual from the start. They were 2 of 14 siblings, born 1 year and 1 day apart, May 12, 1930, and May 11, 1931, respectively. Extremely close to their brother Alfred, a couple of years older, the entire family were natives of Donaldsonville, Georgia. Their parents, George and Rachel, owned a small farm in Donaldsonville. George devout enough to actually help build a local church. But the backbreaking burden of attempting to raise such a large family in the rural Depression South proved onerous, and the Anglin family relocated to Ruskin, Central Florida, to take advantage of a growing economy. The entire family worked together, frequently as seasonal migrants as far north as Michigan. But the Anglin brothers also had difficulty acclimating to the local Florida school system. Their worn-out, unfashionable clothes and status as new students, subjecting them to ridicule. Eventually, they rarely attended school, initially spending time aimlessly at the beach before resorting to burglarizing homes and businesses in an attempt to acquire cash. Clarence Anglin was only 14 when he was sentenced to reform school for crimes ranging from truancy to grand larceny, in this case the Florida Industrial School for Boys. John was soon sent to the same facility for similar crimes. They spent the rest of their teenage years engaging in negative behavior with predictable results. Even more predictably, they eventually outgrew their juvenile status, and new convictions got them sent to the penitentiary at Rayford, Florida. Their brother Alfred also began ringing up similar convictions for crimes like auto theft and burglary. One talent that the Anglins did seem to possess was the ability to escape from penal institutions. By 1957, both Clarence and Alfred Anglin had successfully fled jail and remained at large, in the case of Alfred, for over 5 years. John Anglin had managed to avoid trouble after serving his time, the result of getting involved in a serious romantic relationship he did not wish to jeopardize. Unfortunately, all three brothers could not resist what they thought was the perfect opportunity for an easy score. One of the reasons Alfred Anglin was able to avoid recapture for such a lengthy period was his frequent changes of address, frequently to out-of-state locations. One of these sanctuaries was the home of an uncle in Columbia, Alabama, a prosperous farmer and mill operator who briefly put Alfred up, unaware of his younger relative's criminal record. While in Columbia, Alfred noticed that a small bank served the local rural agricultural community, a customer base that dealt mostly in cash. Months after leaving the area, Alfred informed both of his brothers of the perceived opportunity, and they began planning a robbery in earnest. They figured the bank's location in a tiny town near a state highway, its small number of employees and large amounts of cash made it an attractive target. Their planning even involved sending Alfred and Clarence's significant others to a rendezvous location in Hamilton, Ohio. At 10 a.m. on January 17, 1958, Clarence and Alfred Anglin burst into the Bank of Columbia, John manning the getaway car. Armed with toy pistols, the two men were able to steal about $18,000 in cash and jewelry, and the trio quickly sped out of town. Returning briefly to the Ruskin, Tampa area to visit with family and leave a modest amount of cash, the brothers soon headed north to Hamilton. When they arrived, they separated into a series of local motels and relatives' homes, figuring they were far away from any potential scrutiny. Back in Columbia, Alabama, as bank robbery was a federal crime, the FBI took charge of the investigation and, using mugshots of known fugitives from the region, quickly identified the Anglins as likely suspects. On January 22nd, only 5 days after the crime, the FBI arrested all three Anglins and the two girlfriends with them. How the FBI located the bank robbers in Ohio so quickly was never determined. Some believe it resulted from a tip from a disgusted family member or even the ex-husband of one of the girlfriends. Both women were eventually released, but the Anglins were not so fortunate. After pleading guilty in federal court and receiving hefty sentences, the Houston County prosecutor responsible for Columbia, Alabama, filed state charges against the bank robbers. Although their defense attorneys consider this obvious double jeopardy, they did little to get the case thrown out. The Columbia community, irate over the robbery, with even the Anglin's uncle demanding a life sentence. All three Anglins were quickly convicted and given additional 25-year sentences to be served at the conclusion of their federal sentences. Despite the ACLU getting involved, appeals went nowhere, and the Anglins, considering their fugitive proclivities, were split up. Alfred to Atlanta, Clarence to Leavenworth, and John to Lewisburg, all maximum security facilities. Alfred and Clarence to serve 15 years, John 10, before their 25-year stretch in Alabama was to even begin. Although maximum security, Lewisburg did not have the same harsh reputation as some of the other penal institutions, but it didn't take long for John Anglin to run into trouble. A little more than a year after he arrived, Anglin was caught with various types of escape-related contraband in his cell, and guards were told that Anglin bragged that he had hacksaw blades and was intent on escaping as quickly as possible. It was decided that he should be sent to the more secure Leavenworth Penitentiary, arriving there on January 25, 1960. There he was reunited with his brother, and based on John's initial good behavior, he was then assigned to work with Clarence on the same kitchen detail. 6 months of a positive attitude on the part of both individuals preceded an escape attempt that was audacious even by the standards of the hardened criminals that populated such a facility. On August 8, 1960, a civilian employee in the kitchen noticed something odd among the stacked metal bread containers that were about to be shipped to another nearby penal facility in Missouri. Despite these containers being filled to capacity with bread, this employee thought he saw some slight movement among the metal stacks. A further inspection revealed Clarence Anglin hiding in a specially altered pair of bread boxes, the bottom and top of 2 of these containers cut out, allowing Anglin to fit inside when the 2 containers were stacked on top of each other. Despite the stacks of bread situated around him, Anglin was quickly detected, his situation not helped by his possession of an improvised shank and metal bar. Although John Anglin was not scheduled to work, he had voluntarily shown up and was involved in pushing the cart carrying the bread boxes to a freight elevator and waiting truck. The brothers' reward for such enterprising behavior, assignment to Alcatraz, John arriving in late October 1960, Clarence in January of 1961. From 4 such utterly dysfunctional individuals, it appeared that their participation in any kind of successful endeavor was impossible, but Allen West provided the first link in a chain of remarkable events. His assignment to the segregation unit of Alcatraz initially had little effect on his behavior, and he continued to be written up for disciplinary infractions, cited 3 times in less than a year, the final citation occurring in October of 1960 for assaulting a corrections officer. But then he seemed to experience a revelation, most likely based on subsequent events, the realization that any attempt to escape from the segregation unit was inconceivable. By April 24, 1961, his conduct improved to the extent that he was assigned a job as a painter, and on his best sociopathic behavior, he was quickly appraised as an excellent and constructive worker. By early May, he was assigned to the prison general population and a position as a painter within the maintenance crew, earning glowing reports describing his 7-day-a-week work schedule and cooperative demeanor. Interestingly, these reports also included the observation that West preferred to work alone. West not only painted various areas of the cell blocks, he also cleaned up after civilian workers repairing plumbing or other utilities in what was known as the utility corridor. The Alcatraz cell block consisted of 4 separate blocks of cells. A was rarely used, except for isolation of certain inmates. B and C blocks, the largest, were 3-story rows containing a total of 336 cells. D block was a smaller 3-story configuration with a total of 42 cells, 36 for segregation and 6 for solitary confinement. Each of these rectangular blocks had a walkway passing on the ground floor with nicknames, the main gap between B and C block known as Broadway. But most importantly for West was the gap between and behind each row of cells in each block, the utility corridor. West, allowed briefly into this area, quickly determined several crucial structural aspects of the gap between the rows of cells. Pipes of all kinds, plumbing, electrical, and water ran from the ground floor all the way to the roof. Also, although painted and covered with a layer of plaster, on the cell side, West could see that the underlying cement behind this veneer was weakening and crumbling, this infrastructure now decades old. So old and corroded that it wouldn't take much to dislodge it, even from the interior of a prison cell. West did not keep this information close to the vest. In July of 1961, John Anglin moved into cell number B-150, right next to his brother Clarence, who was in B-152. This seems like a strange omission by prison supervision, as both Anglins next to each other was sure to allow for much easier communication, none of it particularly constructive with regard to obeying the rules. Within weeks, both West and Frank Morris were also next to each other on the same row, critical because new policies meant to relax the tense prison atmosphere were being implemented, including 4 men at a dining room table as opposed to the traditional 10. It was felt that if prisoners had the chance to sit and socialize with the individuals of their choice, it would diminish the periodic violence in the dining room. But this also gave groups like West, Morris, and the Anglins the chance to discuss their plans in greater privacy. It was common knowledge that the ventilator shafts on the roof of the cell block were possibly accessible, despite official attempts to make them impenetrable. These ventilators were no longer operable, and some were completely dismantled and the resulting openings sealed with cement. But it was believed that despite attempts to make the remaining ventilators inaccessible, it was the consensus among the prison population that it might be possible to remove whatever impediments existed, allowing access to the roof. But that did not solve the problem of how to get from Alcatraz to the mainland, and after quickly dismissing the impossible option of swimming, the 4 conspirators brainstormed on what methods should be implemented. They not only came up with the idea of constructing life preservers, they also hit on a completely untried method of escape, constructing a raft that they could inflate and row to safety. And the material required for such devices was already obtainable, rubber surplus Navy raincoats that were standard issue to each prisoner. They estimated that they would need approximately 50 raincoats to construct what they needed. They also hit upon a unique idea to evade detection during any escape for as long as possible. They would construct dummy heads to leave behind in their beds so that the routine cell checks conducted at night would not reveal their absence. These were all ambitious plans, but this core group was in key prison positions to obtain materials and information that could make such a scheme a reality. West was even more embedded within his maintenance crew, getting guards to allow him to paint the ceilings of the cell blocks, which required a 3-story scaffold, allowing him individual, unobserved free rein to examine ventilation ducts, steal potentially helpful objects, and hide incriminating materials that might be discovered in an inmate cell search. Morris was assigned to the industries area of Alcatraz, essentially a series of task-oriented operations that provided both job training and services essential to running the prison. These shops included dry cleaning, furniture refinishing, laundry, clothing, and glove manufacture and brush assembly. Morris worked in the brush shop area, helping to construct some of the brooms used to sweep up in the prison. This area was filled with all sorts of tools, sewing machines, drills, solvents, paints, varnishes, glues, and any number of materials and implements that could help construct and assemble a means of escape. Although metal detectors were used to screen prisoners upon their return to the cell block, certain critical materials were still easily obtainable. John Anglin worked in the laundry sorting area of the prison, tasked with preparing dirty clothes for cleaning and organizing clean laundry for distribution. Part of his inventory included a massive supply of the prized Navy raincoats. John also developed a sudden interest in art and painting. In November of 1961, from the prison canteen, he purchased paintbrushes and several canvas squares to engage in this new interest, although a not uncommon hobby among the Alcatraz inmates. Of course, this explained the presence of paint that he used for his artwork, as well as another clandestine form of sculpture. Clarence Anglin was assigned to the prison barber shop, a position that also provided as much hair as he could covertly remove, material that also was essential for the prospective dummy heads they were intent on constructing. But Clarence evinced a dangerous trait that was also a potential problem with West. They frequently hinted or even shared their plans with other inmates, even attempting to recruit other individuals into their scheme. Observing their talkative ways, these other streetwise cons decided that the plan was too complicated to carry out, and the ringleaders' big mouths, who might jeopardize the escape before it even got off the ground. Still, because of the collective hostility towards the facility of Alcatraz itself, and the knowledge that a successful escape might be the impetus to shut down the prison entirely, any uninvolved but knowledgeable inmate was hoping for the escape to succeed. That, coupled with the awareness that anyone who ratted out the escapees would surely face retribution, no matter where they transferred to, was enough to protect the secrecy of any potential escape effort. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about the escape from Alcatraz. Information for this podcast came from the books Escaping Alcatraz by Michael Esslinger and Breaking the Rock by Jolene Babyak. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.